Topic 47A, the origins of the Cold War and the Cold War in Europe, 1945 to 1968. You should take notes during this podcast, pause it as necessary, and listen to it as many times as you need to, as you will need them to complete future graded assignments. I recommend that you take notes in the Cornell method of note-taking as presented in Podcast 3 of this course. By the end of this podcast, you should be able to define the Cold War, understand how the Cold War impacted Europe between 1945 and 1968, and identify key foreign policy goals of the U.S. between those years, especially in relation to Europe. The end of the Cold War in 1945 witnessed the death of one geopolitical system and the birth of a new one. As the war left much of Europe impoverished and decimated, the dominance of colonial empires in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East by former European empires like France and England waned. Into this political vacuum stepped the United States and the Soviet Union, also called the USSR. The US and the Soviets had served as allies against the Axis powers of fascist Germany, Italy, and Japan during World War II, but they had always made strange bedfellows. American ideals of democracy and capitalism clashed with communism and socialism, the political and economic foundations of the Soviet Union. While the leaders of these two nations, FDR or Franklin Delano Roosevelt, seen here at center, and Joseph Stalin, at right, respectively, put these differences aside to defeat Hitler, Mussolini, and Hirohito after the war, their ideological differences seemed even greater because they were the only superpowers left standing. These political, economic, and ideological differences between the United States and the USSR grew into what is known as the Cold War, which lasted from the end of World War II in 1945 to the collapse of the USSR in 1991. As many of you know, this war of ideas and cultures has been termed cold because the two sides never engaged in direct military confrontation. The stakes were simply too high. After the U.S. dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, ending the war against Japan, the world witnessed the annihilating capabilities of nuclear weaponry. Once the Soviet Union acquired nuclear capabilities as well, the threat of atomic war between the US and USSR always existed. But, lucky for us, this threat never materialized, so the quote-unquote war between the two remained cold. Nevertheless, the US and the USSR managed to wage their ideological war through a variety of proxies around the world during the Cold War. For example, as Europe lay in ruins in 1945, the continent quickly got pulled into the orbit of either superpower. In Western Europe, countries like England, France, Italy, Belgium, and the Netherlands fell within the American orbit. They accepted funds from America's so-called Marshall Plan, or European Recovery Program, designed to rebuild Western European economies so that the citizens of these countries would be less likely to vote for local communist parties in post-war elections. Many also joined with the U.S. and Canada to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in 1949, pledging themselves to come to the aid of other member countries in the event of attack from an outsider. The outsider that NATO countries worried most about, of course, was the Soviet Union. After holding down the Eastern Front against Hitler alone and losing a total of 17 million people in World War II, Stalin sought to inoculate the Soviet Union against future German aggression by putting a buffer of countries loyal to the Soviets between the USSR and Germany. Thus, countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, seen here in Eastern Europe, got pulled into the Soviet Union's orbit, together eventually forming the Warsaw Pact to counter what they perceived as the threat of NATO. Very quickly, Europe became divided into eastern and western halves, separated by an invisible boundary that British Prime Minister Winston Churchill called an Iron Curtain in 1946. Nowhere was the Iron Curtain more visible than in post-war Germany. As the defeated power in World War II, the country was split into two: the Federal Republic of Germany, or what became known as West Germany, now allied with NATO and the United States, and East Germany, or the German Democratic Republic, part of the Soviets' Warsaw Pact. The former German capital, Berlin, was divided into 4 quadrants in the immediate aftermath of the war, one held by each of the victors: the US, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. In what may have been the first of many tense incidents of the Cold War, in 1948, the Soviets tried to force the Americans out of Berlin by cutting off access points into the city. The Soviets were able to do this because Berlin lay deep within East Germany, a nation controlled exclusively by the USSR. Outside the boundaries of West Berlin, a tiny haven of democracy and capitalism, deep in a sea of communism and socialism, lay the Soviets. The Soviets hoped to pull West Berlin, and therefore the entire former capital of the Germans, and a powerful symbol, into its orbit. The Americans, however, were determined to not allow this to occur. Motivated by the Truman Doctrine of containment, or that the threat of communism needed to be contained to the areas it existed and not allowed to spread any further, the Americans airlifted supplies like essential food and medicine into West Berlin for 9 months until the Soviets relented and reopened the routes to the city. The Americans believed that a strong sign of commitment to the people of West Berlin was necessary to signal to the Soviets that the U.S. would not permit future aggression in Europe. Though the Berlin airlift was successful for the moment, the Soviets militarily suppressed movements for democracy throughout Eastern Europe into the 1960s. In 1956, tanks rolled into Budapest, Hungary, to put down a student rebellion against Soviet policies, and in 1968 they did the same in Prague, the capital of what was then Czechoslovakia. And in the city of Berlin itself, the Soviet-backed East German government decided to erect a physical barrier between the two halves of the city in 1961 to prevent their citizens from migrating to the western side of the city. Though these migrations and the rebellions in Budapest and Prague prove that people living behind the Iron Curtain did not want to live under communist rule, they would be forced to do so until around 1990. While the Cold War wreaked devastation and tragedy in Europe, it was hardly limited to that continent, though. In the next podcast, we'll explore the impact of the Cold War in the so-called Third World. Before closing with a look at an American newsreel from the first anniversary of the erection of the Berlin Wall, make sure that you can answer each of the learning objectives for this podcast. Write out each one in a sentence or a paragraph now. If you find that you cannot do so, Go back to the beginning of the podcast, listen and watch again, and pause it as necessary to supplement the notes you've already taken until you can easily answer all of the learning objectives above. Now, let's take a look at that video from more than 50 years ago.
West Berlin tolls in sympathy for East Germans on the first anniversary of the Wall of Shame that holds them prisoners. It was just a year ago that authorities in communist Germany, appalled at the numbers who were fleeing to the west, threw up the wall. East German boss Ulbricht cut worshippers from their churches, separated parents from their children. But at the same time, he unwittingly united Germany as never before. On this anniversary, wreaths are placed where people died jumping to freedom. And at checkpoints, authorities are on the alert to prevent outbreaks among West Berliners who might seize on the anniversary to vent their wrath on East German guards. U.S. patrols check a segment of the 95-mile-long barrier. There are brief memorial services led by Mayor Willy Brandt in tribute to the scores who died seeking freedom. The slogan of the day among the West Berliners is marked on the cross, "We accuse." They march along the wall, a display of silent contempt for communist efforts to imprison their friends and relatives. At dusk, tensions erupt in a rock-throwing barrage. The police have their hands full and don't succeed in quieting the Westerners for some time. The anniversary day of the shameful wall.